There are 6 items in Tynwald this week relating to climate change. Overall emissions are to be reduced by at least 35% by 2030 and 45% by 2035. There's a ban on microbeads and single-use plastics, including plates, bags, straws, stirrers, cutlery and cups. And there's a clear plan and roadmap for us to become carbon neutral by 2050. Daphne Kane chairs the Climate Change Transformation Board, and Professor Curran has been a lead advisor to government in developing the climate change plan and targets. I spoke to them in a rather echoey room in government offices. I suppose the obvious first question is, why does Tynwald need to bother with any of this? I mean, most people would recognise perhaps that climate change is a thing, but the scale and size of what the Isle of Man is, what it emits, it makes it hardly worth bothering with.
Yeah, okay, climate change is a thing. It's a very, very big thing, and it's causing chaos around the world and huge costs to society and economies around the world. So it's a thing that we definitely, every single person on the planet needs to take very, very seriously and support deep actions to prevent it getting worse, because it will get worse unless we really, really change the way we all live and do business on the planet. So it's a thing, but boy, it's a big thing.
And Daphne, I mean, why, again, you often hear, I mean, you'll have heard this many a time because you've done phone-in programmes and meetings. A number of people in the Manx public just say, well, our influence on all of this is so small. Why do we need to bother?
Well, it's the same principle as a drop in the ocean. But, you know, if everybody threw back the starfish, if everybody does their little bit, it all builds into a bigger thing, and it helps the world. And also, reputationally, do we want to be dirty, polluting, unadapted island which isn't playing its part in our international obligation for the betterment of society in general? But actually, it's at the moment in the middle of an energy crisis and a cost of living crisis. When we're talking about reducing our emissions, burning less fossil fuel, actually that's going to bring down the cost of things as well, ultimately, as well as benefiting us in ways to the environment, to our biodiversity, reducing pollution. What's not to like? And although you say we do get phone-ins, I think that the tide has turned. I think more people, and we know from our research, almost 70% of people describe themselves as concerned or very anxious about climate change. And actually, the hollering I get, the most noise now, I think, is why haven't we taken action yet? Why hasn't the Isle of Man got on with it?
And actually, that's a good question, I suppose, to you, Professor Curran. It is fair to say that we've known about this for many decades, really. Why do you think it is that it's taken so long for countries, not just the Isle of Man, to actually get their act together on this?
I think there's many reasons. Certainly climate scientists have been warning of climate change for over 100 years, actually, and there's been growing evidence for at least 50 years. And in the last couple of decades, yes, I think it's become more and more evident to people around the world the degree of seriousness that we need to attach to climate change. But it's tough for governments. I mean, running countries is a difficult job, and there's always other priorities get in the way. Recently we've had COVID, now we have wars, and we have a cost of living crisis. So I don't envy politicians their job. It is hard, and many people will say politicians should be there to lead. They can only lead to a degree. They can't be too far out ahead of their populations. And at the same time, I have been all my life an environmental regulator. I know that there are deeply vested interests right across the economy and in big business who have gone out of their way to discredit climate change, and that has had a cumulative effect for many, many years. So it's been a very difficult background and context in which to drive forward real ambition at the national and international level on climate change. I think recently we've gone through what you might call a social tipping point, and there will and already is an economic tipping point as well, when everything becomes much clearer that we have to take action. And if we don't, as Daphne just said, you become a pariah nation. You're left behind, trailing in the wake of other countries that are much more progressive. So I think there will be a very rapid acceleration around the world, and I am completely convinced that the world will reach net zero in 2050, and we will avoid the worst impacts of climate change, but we certainly won't avoid it all now.
And Daphne, I mean, one of your colleagues, who shall remain nameless, provided me with one of these American conspiracy theorist books and said, "Here, have a look at this. There's some really good evidence in here." And sadly, it is full of conspiracy theory nonsense dressed up as fact. There's still an awful lot of persuading to do with a relatively small number, perhaps, of the population, but people still need to be convinced about this.
There is a small number who remain to be convinced, but I feel that the overwhelming majority have been convinced, and the more you see programmes exposing for instance, the vested interests of the fossil fuel industry. BBC recently had a programme, and just as the tobacco industry did many years ago, saying, no, it's absolutely fine to smoke, the oil industry very much said, no, it's not us, it's nothing to do with us, even though they were carrying out research that proved that fossil fuel burning was responsible for climate change. And when you see people whose homeland, whose island nations have been devastated by the impacts of climate change, then you really start to feel that we are all one world, and the Isle of Man is a part of that world. And the Isle of Man, in a smaller way, has experienced climate change, increasing rainfall events, flooding, and increasing high levels of sea, overtopping of the sea. They're only going to get more frequent, and more people, more livelihoods will be at risk. So why wouldn't the Isle of Man want to ensure that we are adapted for the climate change that we are going to experience? While we can hope that if everybody plays their part and we manage as the world to keep the increase in temperatures below 2 degrees and hopefully below 1.5 degrees, there are still changes that are evident now that we are experiencing. And you talk to people around Laxey, nobody's forgotten the several floods and recovering from that. But there's an economic impact still, with people not able to get house insurance for flood, and the fear factor. I mean, I've spoken to young children who were young when the last flood happened, who are still nervous, run upstairs if it rains. So there is an impact on us. It is felt in the community, and for a large part of my constituency, and I think the island, it's the message now: please just get on and do something, take the action, bring us the renewables, bring down our emissions, but also make the Isle of Man a better, healthier, greener place for everybody.
And again, Professor Curran, you alluded earlier to the difficulties that governments face. I mean, there are inevitable difficulties, and certainly with the current cost of living crises, it is hard to see how government can manage to afford to do all the things it needs to do. And yet, it is fair to say that many of the cost of living crises could have been avoided if we lived in a more sustainable way.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that comment you just made. Absolutely. It is so clear now that in terms of energy supply to the population and to business and to industry, the cheapest form by a country mile is solar and wind generation, far, far cheaper than the escalating price of oil and gas. And it's been predicted for many years that oil and gas will eventually run out anyway. So why would anyone want to go on exploiting it when there are much, much cheaper options? And at the same time, to ally that to increasing energy efficiency, again, both within the economy and at the domestic and personal level, where you can take control and drive down your own costs of living through insulation and double glazing, All of that makes absolute sense. And if you want to live in a more secure and resilient world, better for your families, better for your employment, then these are the obvious courses and actions to take for the future.
Michelle Hayward is a member of the Environment Department. You're taking a motion to Tynwald, and it's in relation to single-use plastics. Tell us a little bit about why the department thinks that this is necessary.
I think it's long been recognised, and there are EU directives around it as well, but it's long been recognised that plastics, when they escape into the environment, don't decompose pretty much ever. They might break down into smaller particles of plastics, but those microplastics now are pretty much found in every environment that we look at. And so we've all been aware of like seeing images of floating plastic garbage patches at sea. Equally, even in the deepest parts of our oceans, you'll find plastic debris that's sunk down there and will sit there and it won't degrade. And so one of the ways in trying to address this problem is to stop that plastic coming into use in the first place. And that's what this legislation is trying to do.
I suppose anyone who's done a beach clean with Bill Dale and Beach Buddies will know that significant amounts of plastic washes up on shore. But of course the other bit, which of course is a bit that you were more interested in perhaps when you were more actively engaged in diving, these microplastics get swallowed up by fish. They get into the food chain, and ultimately, if you eat fish, you potentially are eating lots of microplastics.
Yeah, there's microplastics in pretty much everything you look at. You run your tumble dryer, and there will be small amount of microplastics given off from that. We know when we're washing clothes, you get microplastics, little bits breaking off the clothes that go into the water that we've used as well. And so, the marine environment, I think, almost it provides some very nice imagery to understand what's happening both on land and in the air, really.
The motion to Tynwald is to effectively ban single-use plastics. Mm-hmm. What's the timescale for this? How long do people have to make the transition between where we are and where we need to be?
We've given businesses a really long lead time. We're not going to say you have to throw away all your stock. We know that a lot of food businesses, for example, will be sitting there across winter and will be ordering things like their packaging for the next summer. So there's over a year of lead time in this for them to use up stocks and then not to buy new ones. But I know I was in one of the wholesalers a couple of weeks ago, and actually if you look at the shelves now, predominantly it's paper-based packaging, there's very little polystyrene, there's very little plastics around. So I think actually the supply chain is moving that way anyway. So for most of our food retailers, they've probably moved that way, and if not, this will be the final sort of push to head them in that direction.
And to a fashion, as you said earlier, we're catching up with legislation elsewhere across Europe. There's a directive on single-use plastics, mm-hmm. and in essence, this is what we're doing, getting our legislation caught up with everyone else.
Well, in some cases, yes, we're catching up. So things like the single-use plastic bags, yeah, that's definitely a catch-up bit. But actually, we've gone beyond that. So we've gone to the things like the stirrers and the cutlery and all of those. So when our legislation goes through, it'll actually be slightly ahead of some of the other jurisdictions in terms of the scope of what we've covered under what's now going to be not allowed.
And I suppose as a member of the Department of Environment, Food and Agriculture, you'll be particularly interested in the motions preceding your motion on the order paper, which are all in relation to climate change, where we seem to have two targets. There's the 35% by 2030, 45% by 2035. Are these ambitious enough, do you think?
In some ways, having any ambition is good compared to what went previously. And so in that ways, I welcome it. Do I think it's ambitious enough? No, if I'm truly honest, I think we could have done better. And in fact, we're taking it relative to our 2018 emissions, which we know were already considerably higher than sort of neighbouring jurisdictions on a per capita basis anyway. So we're almost like we've picked a high starting point and then not set it very high. And I think because we picked that high starting point, we probably should have tried to push a little bit more. They are targets. I hope there's nothing to say you can't exceed a target.
Well, indeed, the motion is worded to say at least 35%.
At least, yeah. So I'm hoping that we manage to achieve something beyond that. But it is really about providing that push to make things head in the right direction, which is, after years of no movement in that way, and in fact almost ignoring the problem up until quite recently. I think this is a really strong and positive move.
Do you think the Manx public understand the enormity of what is going to be potentially decided in Tynwald this week?
I think some of them do, and it's not very long since the election, and going back to being on the doorstep, it was something that was raised time and again about why have we not? Why are we not moving on this? So I think there will be quite a sizable chunk of the population that welcomes the fact that things are actually starting to filter through, and it was fine declaring a climate change emergency, but then you have to work out what to do about it, and that takes a while to make sure you've got your data and make sure you've got your options. So I think the fact that these targets are in there, I think, will be welcomed by some people. There will always be those within society who don't want to accept that climate change is real or that it's driven by human activity, and they will undoubtedly push back against this. I think throughout this, we talk about things like a just transition and things like that, but actually what we're all interested in is maintaining our quality of life, because we like the way we live, and it's making those changes whilst trying to maintain that quality of life that's going to be the big challenge for us.
One of the things I particularly liked about the timeline, which it's only a sheet of A4, but it has its very own motion on the order paper. But it was rather good that not alongside actions and times there were benefits, and I suppose many people, when they're looking at this, they're looking at the cost, they're thinking about the changes in their lives, and maybe the benefits are something that we need to spend a bit more time focusing on.
Yeah, and one of the aspects of work that DEFRA are involved in is air quality testing around the island. We've got 60 sites that we're testing air quality at now. If you can reduce the level of car emissions, then almost immediately you've got an improvement in nitrous oxide levels, and particularly where those roads run past schools or care homes where we've got vulnerable people. That's almost an immediate benefit that you can start seeing creep through. Now we know that in atmospheric terms it's going to take decades to turn around the damage that we've done with how much CO2 is actually in the atmosphere, but at the same time there are the more immediate, more local benefits that we can see coming from that.
We spoke several months ago now about the potential for blue carbon. Any progress with that? Any little hints or glimmers that we could find out about?
Yeah, the team have been out and they've been taking core samples from a variety of sites. So some of them onshore, and to look at how much carbon is stored in the sediment around our shores. And as you'd expect on a sandy shore, you're not storing very much carbon in those. But they've also done some sampling from some of the deeper water sites where you've got silty or mud substrates. And there's a significant increase in the amount of carbon that is stored away in that seabed. And so that gives you all sorts of information. We can look at the rate that carbon gets deposited in there, and you can estimate how much carbon storage is going on. And although it's entirely natural processes driving that, it gives you a chance to look and say, well, depending on what we do as humans, what's the risk to that carbon store there as well. So there's obviously more work to come. This is only year 1 out of 3, but at the moment the initial results are giving us some quite valuable data in understanding how much carbon is stored in our seas.
And we know, of course, about the potential for planting trees on the landscape. We can see them. It's all pretty obvious and straightforward, although it is fair to say that the 85,000 tree planting exercise wasn't the greatest of success. Most of our territory is under the sea. Is there similar opportunity there in relation to potentially planting kelp forests or things like this?
Theoretically, you could. Kelp will grow where kelp wants to grow, though, and come sort of September, October. Usually the kelp starts to break down by then. It's been heavily colonised by various things that live on kelp as a substrate, and so it'll shed its fronds, and actually most of it will get ripped off in sort of winter storms and end up on the beaches, and then people can write in complaining about tractors pushing seaweed around on beaches. So it doesn't give you a long-term store unless it ends up down in that sediment, and so the real value is what's in the sediment rather than what's floating around. Obviously it contributes to that sedimentation process. Could you do something like a seaweed farm and things like that? Somebody did send me a paper where it's been tried somewhere else in the world, and they were farming seaweed, then collecting it and taking it out and dumping it into 3,000 metres deep of water. And I laughed at that because it's just never going to be anything. I don't even know how much fossil fuel was spent taking on the boat, taking out seaweed to dump it in the sea. But it seems like the height of insanity to me. I think it's probably more likely when we've done the Blue Carbon Project that we can look at our activities within the sea and what do we need to do to protect those, and to make sure that as much sedimentation as can happen is actually happening, and we're not doing anything to interrupt that process.
Where are we up to then in terms of addressing climate change? Is this the motions going to Tynwald? Are they stumbling steps in the right direction? Are they bold initiatives, or something between the two?
I think it feels like it's been slow to get off the ground, but there's been a lot of groundwork done to get to this point, and the fact that there's actual plans coming forward and actual targets, I think, is a really good step in the right direction. Could we do more? Arguably, we knew about climate change 30, 40 years ago, and yes, we could have done more, and it's one of the reasons I got into politics, is the frustration with not doing more. It's really hard to take those steps. It's a big risk for politicians now, because we are saying we will disrupt what goes on in life and what you're used to and what you're comfortable with, but we have to do that because the long-term goals are so important, and that we can't ignore them anymore. And I think politically it's always been difficult to take those steps and to become that disruptive influence. So it's been shied away from. Now I think I'm hoping the House backs the moves and we carry on moving in the right direction. And there's certainly been a show that there is commitment to following this through.
And there are obviously costs associated with this, but potentially investment opportunities as well.
There's investment opportunities, and I think if you go to decarbonising our electricity supply, that would have saved us from so much cost exposure at the moment. Our cost of our electricity and our cost of gas is just enormous. Had we invested in renewables and had some more of that supply been coming from our own wind-powered turbines, then we'd been in a much better place financially. So I think we're now starting to see some of the cost risks associated with not taking action.
There are several climate change related items on the Tynwald order paper. Daphne Kane explains why.
Well, the Act actually ties in for a minister having to move the significant action plan and other documents coming before Tynwald. Chief Minister is also moving a new, more ambitious interim target for 2030 of 35%. And the action plan supports that in all the itemised actions and strategies that need to come forward to deliver that. And I shall be moving the first interim target that actually Tynwald approved in March of the 45% reduction in emissions by 2035. That's a piece of administration actually, because it wasn't legally enforced because a piece of paper wasn't signed at the right time. But Tynwald has already approved that, so that is a bit of tidying up.
And in terms of the various motions, I mean, there seems to be a certain amount of repetition. So why do we need to have separate motions, for example, for the plan and the roadmap?
It's a separate motion purely because the 5-year action plan is as set out under the Act, that we must always have one in force. In fact, to put this together has been an incredibly hard operation across many departments, with a climate change transformation team working really hard to get something that can be evidence supported by lots of research, input from many departments, to be able to say this is I think the most significant document to come forward in terms of our climate change journey, but that is the 5-year plan. The roadmap to net zero is there to put it into context of the significant milestones along the journey. The first 5-year plan is, but obviously 2030, when we see thanks with the partnership through Manx Utilities and Council of Ministers supporting Manx Utilities investing in a second undersea interconnector to bring greener, cleaner energy to the Isle of Man, that way to enable us to decarbonise completely from the gas-powered power station, and also to invest in a minimum of 20 megawatt renewables to be delivered on island. So what can be achieved, now that is hoped to be achieved with the renewables in the time of this 5-year plan, but the other significant events can be seen in that. I think it's pretty easy to read roadmap to net zero, and they're all part of the picture. So to give somebody, and it's pretty technical and detailed when you get through the action plan into the appendices, and I think there are over 30 pieces of research strategies and plans that need to come forward to be progressed, to be delivered. It's a massive step for the Isle of Man, coming from a position 30 years or more behind our neighbouring jurisdictions, to set on this journey, and it will require everybody to make certain changes in their lives for hopefully an improvement in our environment for everybody.
Is it fair to say that there's too much bureaucracy associated with all of this? Because the interim report or the phase 1 report, there does seem to be a lot of things that have happened, but in terms of the actual meaningful stuff which is going to help us reduce carbon, there seems to be a lot of bureaucracy being reported, not so much of the direct action.
I would love to cut through the bureaucracy, but in terms of how government works, how we're structured, how we invest significant sums of public money for, we need to be sure that when we're spending millions of pounds, that we're spending it in the right areas that is going to have the maximum positive impact in terms of reducing our emissions, making better low carbon homes, warmer environment for people, less polluting transport systems. That's why with the plan, the way it's structured, looks at the different areas where we are aiming for a 15% reduction across every single sector. So whether that is buildings, transport, land and agriculture, business and waste, but alongside that a 10% increase in sequestration, and that is all part of the picture. But that we're talking crosses all the departments. It's where our island plan comes into the fore, and the economic strategy that's being proposed that puts sustainability at the heart of all our policies. And what's not to like from an island perspective, from an island resident, you would want to see better, warmer homes, costing less to heat, being more energy efficient, and switching away from fossil fuel boilers. But this is, that has implications and knock-on effect on the building trade, the house construction industry, but also how we live our lives, what vehicles we choose to purchase. Do we drive individually, or are there going to be more hire vehicles for if and when we need it? And then we get 15-minute communities with people living and working without having to do massive commutes and causing congestion. So how we live, and that has implications in terms of quality of life for the future. Would you want your children to experience the life as you've known it, or would you hope things would be better in the future? Some people think that the Elizabethan age we've just seen has perhaps been the boom time, and there's going to be a period of struggle before we manage to implement some of these policies and make it a better island for everybody.
And I suppose, Professor Curran, some also might say that it's been an age of excess, and maybe this is part of the problem of where we've ended up.
I would agree. I think we've come to realise that we have been living excessively in certain respects in the near past. But Daphne has very eloquently described the future we can look forward to, which is a much more sustainable future where people will be happier and healthier, and we will have a stronger, more resilient economy with longer lasting businesses and creating far less waste. As a society, as you've rightly pointed out, over the past decades we have generated so much waste, and we need very much to move towards more of a circular economy, and that is built into, it's part of the climate change plan, it's part of the economic thinking of the island as well, that we move towards an economy where the items that we consume, the products that we all need to use in our everyday lives, are designed to be much more repairable, much more upgradable. If they need to be, they can be taken apart and the various components used. And actually the bottom of the hierarchy is then recycling those materials. So we used to think recycling was the great solution to all of our problems. Actually, it's designing all of our products in an entirely novel way and constructing them in ways that even recycling is a kind of least preferable option. So it's really quite an exciting time to look forward to a much happier and healthier and prosperous future. And that is all part of what this plan is about.
And one of the areas which there has been significant excess, and we only have to look around the streets, particularly of the developed world, to see significant numbers of people who are overweight or obese. Food waste, various estimates range between 30 and 50% of the food that is produced is wasted or consumed to excess. Clearly, a lot of the food production systems require high levels of inputs, particularly fertilizers. Presumably, then, if we produced less, wasted less, there'd still be enough for people to eat, and it could be a much more sustainable system.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct in pointing out, particularly in our food production and consumption system, there is enormous waste. And it's particularly tragic when you see many parts of the world where people starve. And as you say, in our kind of Western society, there are many people eating and consuming the wrong products and becoming unhealthy through that route. So it exposes many of the inequalities that our system promulgates. And we can't solve everything at one time, but there is a great opportunity here on the island. And I remember 3 years ago having discussions with the National Farmers Union here, who seemed to be very aware and very proactive themselves in wanting to change the systems of food production and consumption here on the island. And it would be my belief that there is an ideal opportunity here in a community like this to create a much more diverse agricultural production system with much more local marketing and much more local consumption of foods tailored to what people on the island want, and a more collaborative approach across the agricultural community and with its customers. I mean, these are the kind of futures we need to look forward to, and with consistent government support, and I know there's a new agri-environment scheme underway, with consistent government support and public support, then we can very easily, I think, adopt a better way of doing business.
And in terms of livestock emissions, there does seem to be some level, at the very least, there's debate as to how significant livestock emissions can be. Many people argue that with very long established livestock production systems like we have in the island, there is no actual addition in relation to climate change because the animals have been being kept, reared, used on the island for many centuries in a similar way. And in fact, if anything, it's possible that livestock levels are slightly lower at the moment than they've been for much of the past several hundred years.
Yeah, I mean, there are various degrees of intensity of livestock rearing, and that is well accepted. And as Daphne was alluding to earlier, the important point is to gather the evidence, to do the assessment, and to chart the optimum route forward. I mean, diets are changing anyway. People are consuming less meat, driven principally by health concerns. And I'm sure the agricultural community needs to and would want to adapt to that anyway. And to produce more for a vegetarian diet on island and reap the benefits of the profits that will accrue from that as well is entirely sensible as a business proposition. But all of that needs to be based on good evidence, which is why part of the climate change plan is about gathering that initial evidence in order to, exactly as Daphne said, inform the optimum decisions to reach the targets that are set out in the plan, which are demanding targets, and they are very short-term targets. So that evidence needs to be gathered pretty quickly.
So then Daphne, Professor Curran there has mentioned that we need to gather evidence. Presumably the aborted Green Living grant is a great evidence gathering exercise. You've been able to determine that perhaps it needs to be in a different form.
It hasn't been aborted, is the first thing. We've suspended new applications for the home energy audits while we tweak the scheme to make it better fit for purpose, and that is with the Department for Enterprise. I know that they have been working very hard. The issue isn't so much with the scheme, because the scheme is there to deliver solutions to property owners to reduce their emissions. So we want that to happen. We do want people to invest in better quality, significant amounts of insulation and double glazing, more sealed doors, so to be able to reduce the energy they consume to heat their homes. Who wouldn't want that, especially given the cost of living crisis and the cost of the energy at the moment? But yes, the scheme needed work. I think when you look back to the end of the last administration, it was a great scheme to say, yes, we're going to have this on the table for residents of the Isle of Man. It is one tiny target amongst dozens contained within the plan. It does need fixing, it needs to be fit for purpose, and it needs to deliver what everybody wants it to deliver, and that is up to £6,000 support for people to put investment into property to reduce energy bills and reduce their emissions. I'm very hopeful that something will be coming forward in the coming month, hopefully next month, from the Department for Enterprise to make the necessary tweaks and make it fit for purpose for the more than 2,000 people who've already entered that system with a view to making property improvements. But in terms of the scheme of what we're doing, all of the sections of the plan, we are of course developing in contact with the industry, with the construction industry and with the agriculture industry and with the landowners and farmers on the island, because they know their own business best and they in many cases know some of the solutions and where it needs to move to. So the various departments responsible for the areas will be in collaboration with us coming up with the plan to take us forward for the other 5-year plans that will follow the current one that we hope Tynwald will support this week.
And in terms of that, I mean, the looking at the roadmap, one thing that stands out primarily, because there's a big gap just as you run up to it, is that by 2024 there will be no fossil fuel boilers in new homes. Do you think people are prepared for this, in terms of just understanding why this is necessary, and also how they can go from something that they're very, very familiar with, and in many cases may have spent 60, 70, 80 years used to a particular way of heating their homes, and then suddenly, as of 2024, if they buy a new home, they've got to get used to something completely different. And
what a wonderful new world you're describing. I think I'd be doing a little happy dance on the roof if it was me, being able to not have an oil-fired boiler anymore, not having to pay gas prices. Yes, the homes fit for the future need to be decarbonised, but efficient, energy efficient. So there are already, Manx Utilities has been rolling out a large number to their customers, switching over to air source heat pumps. And I'm told by colleagues who've installed one of those in their own property, actually the cost is about £100 a month, paying off over a 10-year interest-free period. and what they're paying for the air source heat pump is below the amount they were paying for their gas bill previously, and that was 2 years ago. So that's in a modern home. What we're talking about is enabling the construction industry to gear up to ensure that when we have the target date for no fossil fuel boilers in new homes, that those new homes are constructed in such a way they don't need a fossil fuel boiler to be able to stay warm and be energy efficient for the residents. So that's all for the future. The other thing actually we're having more of a clamour for from the industry at the minute is saying, oh, actually, can we bring forward the date by which we have energy performance certificates on all homes? Because that has now a bearing in terms of marketing or selling your property or renting a property, and also for the future. New homes should all be to a very high standard, but all homes in the future need to adapt to climate change and take all those measures which are different because of our coastal location and also because of the traditional form of building on the Isle of Man. But be very sure that has to be an early target, because the emissions from homes actually is our highest sector, and they just need to come down.
And in terms of the whole the housing sector, house building or any sort of construction really, part of the problem that we face is the huge amount of carbon that goes into producing the materials that we require to build with. Particularly cement seems to require vast amount of energy to make. What is a sustainable, a low carbon home? Not looking now at the heating side or the powering side, but the actual construction side. What does that look like in the future?
Gosh, what an interesting question, and quite a challenging one to answer. But just picking up on some points that Daphne made there, I don't think we should ever underestimate the willingness of people to adopt new technologies, and that bears, a reference to your question as well. We all seem to want the latest mobile phone, 5G or whatever it is now. We all talk quite happily about broadband and Bluetooth and so on. These are very complex technical issues, but we're very happy to adopt those technologies and to move on and to be seen to be modern and progressive. Well, the same, I believe, is true of things like domestic heating. So we should not overemphasize the fact that this is very difficult and people will resist it. I don't think they will. But when it comes to actually constructing houses, yes, it's something I looked at many years ago in Scotland, and I tried to get the entire cycle of blame, as it was often called, together as to why we end up with a built environment that is basically pretty unsustainable. So that is the developer, the client, if you like, who wants to develop a housing estate or a new building, the architect, the construction company, but also taking it beyond that to the people who fit out buildings and the people who maintain and run buildings, and then ultimately those who take buildings down and demolish them. All of them blame each other for having an unsustainable built environment. It's crucially important that that community that creates our built environment gets together and begins to think, as I said earlier, about a circular economy. So it's about designing buildings from the outset that are entirely sustainable. And that means buildings that you can take apart or you can modify, or why not even move? There are some countries in the world where whole buildings are jacked up and moved. And if you design buildings in the right way, they're much easier to maintain, certainly much cheaper and easier to heat or cool when we're looking at climate change in the future, but also fitting out the building internally. I often make the point that for me, the most fantastic and sustainable design is the carpet tile. And I'm not here to advertise any particular company, but there is a global company, and it is hugely profit-making, that now manufactures carbon negative carpet tiles, entirely made of recycled material. The carpet tile itself, and this is just a little example, is such a sustainable design, because if you lay down a new carpet and then the next day you spill a glass of red wine in the middle of it, if that's a fitted carpet, you have to take the whole thing out, and the majority of carpets still go to landfill. If it's a carpet tile, you remove one carpet tile, you can even put it in the washing machine. What a brilliant design. And when they're now being manufactured as carbon negative, using entirely recycled materials, and I won't name this company because I'm not here to do that, but they are now talking of what they call forest factories. Those factories that manufacture these carpet tiles will actually put more back into nature than they take out in the way of raw materials and resources. This is all perfectly possible, and that is a global company that is very profit making. So it's about fitting out the building, it's about running the building, it's about what you do with the building. Do you either move it or disassemble it, or if you have to knock it down in 50 years' time, then every component is reusable and recyclable. Now, that is a challenge, and we're nowhere near satisfying it at the moment, but we're moving there. You mentioned cement. There is now very much reduced carbon emitting cement being produced, and we can also now, and it's beginning to happen in Sweden, produce steel that is zero carbon as well. So the change is coming.
And as you approach the end of your time working with the Isle of Man government, what would you say the highlights of the journey have been? And I'm guessing you're going to tell me you're reasonably optimistic for the future.
I'm hugely optimistic for the future, of course I am. Speaking very personally, I've loved being here on the island. It's just sad that COVID intervened, so the great majority of what advice and input I've been able to give has been done remotely. But when I was here at the beginning in preparation for and to create the original impact report, I worked with the most fantastic team here on the island, brought together from across all the government departments, and genuinely that's been one of the highlights of my life, working with that fantastically committed team and producing the impact report in, literally it was in 3 or 4 months. That was a really intense period of work, but I loved every minute of it, and I look back on that with a great deal of fondness. But now, as we said, it's into delivery. It's absolutely the right time for me to step back. That's not my bundle of skills, to be honest. I have views on how to deliver, but I hope I've contributed to the development phase, and it's now for others with a more appropriate range of skills to get in there and deliver, and I am absolutely firmly optimistic it will be done.
So, Daphne Kane, final word then. Professor Curran has helped you deliver the plan. All you have to do now is deliver it.
If only it was that simple. First of all, we need to obtain Tynwald's support and backing for us to take forward the plan, because make no mistake, this is a significant ambition for the Isle of Man to go on this journey and to achieve what we hope to within the first 5 years, and then beyond to 2050. But I think the Isle of Man owes a debt of gratitude to Professor Curran from that first impact report, and for being able to sit on our shoulder and see all the business coming before the Climate Board and giving his input and words of wisdom and knowledge from a scientific background. I think that the Isle of Man is in an infinitely better place and more positive place in knowing how we can move forward. But the plan requires not only the political support, which we hope will be forthcoming, but as Professor Curran mentioned, this is a plan for the island. It's not my plan. It's not even the Climate Board's plan. It's a plan for the island to sit alongside our economic strategy, our island plan, to deliver a better, more sustainable future for the island, for our biosphere, and to enable generations to come to think that, yes, I think there is a line in the plan about handing on an island that is better for the future generations, in the hope that they will live better, healthier, less polluted lives, and that they will go on to do the same for the future generations.
That was Daphne Kane, MHK, Chair of the Climate Change Transformation Board, and Professor Curran, Lead Advisor to Government in Addressing Climate Change. There is so much more we could have talked about, particularly in relation to the proposed new plan. But does the plan have sufficient ambition and clarity to deliver the widely acknowledged need for urgent action? Is the whole activity surrounding climate change just another fad that we'll eventually tire of and move on to the bigger issues of the day? Or is it really a roadmap to a better future? I suspect the debate will rumble on, but it appears that in Tynwald at least, there is a consensus that big steps need to be taken. I hope you enjoyed the programme, which will be available as a podcast from Manx Radio's website. Please get in touch with Phil Gorn at manxradio.com and let me know your thoughts and views on the programme. And let me know what you would like to talk about in future programmes. But for now, I'm Phil Gorn. Gora Mayusan Geishak Rum. Thanks for listening.